Some people ask, why do English people care about Anglo-Saxons? Aren't we a Celtic people? Isn't it a bit weird that we think of ourselves as Germanic? In 2012, Mitt Romney referred to the ethnic English diaspora using a term that has fit this meaning for centuries, Anglo-Saxon. That's how we've always described ourselves, not just we English people, but the Australians, the Canadians, and the Americans. But for some reason, the liberal media in Britain met this comment by Mitt Romney with heavy criticism. They said, we're not Anglo-Saxons anymore. We might as well refer to Jews. Why do you call us Anglo-Saxons? We don't have anything in common with you in that sense. We're not Anglo-Saxons. But genetic research has consistently showed that we do have Anglo-Saxon DNA. There was one study which showed that 30 to 40% of the DNA of people in Britain was Anglo-Saxon, but that this was higher when you were in England, of course. This was done by Ancestry.com. It was based on their own samples. They found that English people have the highest amount of Scandinavian genes in Great Britain and also the highest amount of German genes. An earlier study, a bit more reputable scientific study, found that Englishmen share about 30% of their DNA with Germans and 9% with Belgians. And both of these were a sort of Anglo-Saxon territories on the continent. Oh yeah, plus 11% with the Danes, which is where the Angles came from. This sounds like quite a lot, but it could be even higher if you consider that Frisian is the language which is most similar to English today, and people from Frisia today are the most genetically similar to English people on the continent. So yeah, I mean, there's always the possibility that the people now living in Denmark and Germany aren't exactly the same as they were back then, genetically. Or also, it's possible that the descendants of the Anglo-Saxon people on the continent who moved to Britain were already genetically distinct slightly from their neighbours, which would mean that the English Anglo-Saxon component is even higher than the 40%. But let's say that we just accept these findings without these problems and just say that the average Englishman is about 40% Anglo-Saxon and 60% Celtic. Now, are either of those terms actually appropriate to describe us ethnically? I would say yes, they both are. There was a 2012 study on Turkish people, that's Turks, who named themselves after the Central Asian Turkic-speaking tribes. But it says the following: the Turkish population has a close genetic similarity to Middle Eastern and European populations, and some degree of similarity even to South Asian and Central Asian populations. So the gene cluster analysis of Turkish people revealed 45% Middle Eastern, 40% European, because it was a European country previously with Anatolian farmers there, and 15% Central Asian, which is the actual Turkic component. So this means genetically the Turkish people are much more like Arabs, or even like Greeks, than they are like the actual Turks. But no one ever says to Turks that they shouldn't call themselves Turks, least of all the liberal media. In the United States, the Amerindian tribes only require that an individual has 25% native ancestry in order to be considered indigenous. This actually varies from tribe to tribe, some tribes having even lower genetic requirements. Well, a study by Mexico's National Institute of Genomic Medicine reported that Mestizo Americans are 58.96% European and only 35% Amerindian. Why then is their cultural identity so closely attached to the Aztecs and not to the conquistadors with whom they share more genetics, more culture, and their language? Anyway, no one is going to deny Mexicans their Aztec heritage. No one's going to deny them their native ancestry, least of all the left-wing media. A paper called The Beaker Phenomenon and the Genomic Transformation of Northwest Europe came out in May this year, and it really puts the genetic differences of the people who populated the British Isles into perspective. It showed that over 90% of Britain's Neolithic gene pool was completely replaced within just a few hundred years between the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age. The original early Neolithic inhabitants of Great Britain, who were responsible for the megalith culture, built all the Stonehenge and all that kind of thing, they were more genetically similar to the people who at that time were living on Iberian Peninsula, the Spaniards, than they are to us. But the people who replaced them in the late Neolithic are the same as us. Basically, the beaker culture in the lower Rhine area of Germany was mixing with the corded ware culture from the east, which had a large steppe component, steppe from the Pontic Caspian steppes, from the Yamnaya, who I've discussed in my Proto-Indo-European video, and they probably spoke an Indo-European language. So they mixed with the beaker people, and the beaker culture of the lower Rhine area then spread out across northwest Europe and basically formed all the ethnicities and genetic makeup of northwest Europe that remains today. What this means is that the Celts, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Belgians, the Vikings, the Northern, all the people who have come to the British Isles right up to the Huguenots are all descended from the exact same group of people, the beaker culture of the lower Rhine area. The only people who aren't are the Romans, and they left no genetic legacy in the British Isles at all that can be easily discovered. Nothing. What this means is that the distinction between Anglo-Saxon and Celt is trivial. Also, as you may already be aware, the distinction genetically between an Anglo-Saxon and a Dane is almost indetectable. At my university, UCL, the history department collaborated with the genetics department on a research on Viking DNA in Britain, which makes very exciting headlines. You may have heard of this study. But what we were told by the scientists who we were working with, who were working with our department, is that there really wasn't very much to distinguish between a Dane and an Anglo-Saxon, and that they were only looking at a very few amount of markers to try and distinguish them. And even then, it was not a foolproof method, because these people were so similar. We really are Northwestern Europeans, one people. In fact, when the Anglo-Saxons and Celts first met in Britain all those centuries ago, they had only been separated by about 2,000 years of genetic drift. They probably didn't look very different from each other, and their cultures were very similar too. English people are Anglo-Saxons, but we are also Britons. Our language, our laws, and our culture come from the Anglo-Saxon Germanic peoples. But some of our blood also comes from people who were here before, who were genetically the same anyway. The term Anglo-Saxon is perfectly suitable for describing our ethnic diaspora around the world today, and any arguments to the contrary are totally invalid unless they at least attempt to level the same sort of criticisms towards far less justifiable ethnicities such as Turkish or Native American.